You're coming to me? Okay, sorry about that, but that'll have been absolutely meaningless to you because I didn't introduce it to you. And slight slip there that it got through. I thought there would have been some sort of that's off the back of the last interview. That's what you got there, and I hope you could make something of it. But anyway, my apologies for that, and we'll keep going. Alistair, how are you? Alistair Livingstone from the Yoga Studio in Newry. You're most welcome as always in the studio.
Thank you very much, Rowan. Very good to see you.
Cork?
I've been to Cork. I was invited to a conference in November that was hosted, interestingly enough, by the School of Midwifery at the University College in Cork, and also it was hosted by an organisation called Critical Voices. And the conference was on the meanings of madness.
Wow. That's close to all of us.
It is close to all of us, and indeed, there is a Michael Corrie who is somebody who's explored this field very extensively, who says that madness is as much a part of being human as joy. It's understandable and has a logical history embedded with its own unique context, and as a reflection of the difficult business of living and experiencing.
Okay, why were you there? You're a yogi. Well, what does madness and yogi to do together?
Well, I'm a yoga practitioner, and I'm laughingly, I think, called a yoga therapist. I trained in London as a therapist, you know. So a lot of the work that I do is with people with physical and mental conditions. And at the moment, I'm actually working a wee bit at St. Luke's Hospital in Armagh.
Wow,
I'm working with
huge,
just a little bit.
Yeah.
But I'm also a homeopath, and so I've had a very long interest in psychological and mental conditions. And of course, homeopathy can address some of those very well. And I've come to believe that yoga itself could be hugely beneficial in this field, not only because it's a hugely grounding and puts people back in touch with their feelings and their bodies.
I alluded to it a moment ago that madness is a close traveller with all of us.
It is indeed.
The dividing line is very, very slender indeed. So really what we're saying that as in an ongoing situation, the practice of yoga is therapeutic in the area of mental instability.
Of course, and of course what's popularly known now as mindfulness training or meditational practices, which are really about stilling the mind and focusing the mind.
Same sort of thing as yoga?
Well, we could have this discussion for quite a long time, but I think ultimately yoga and meditation are the same.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I think
because the steps to meditation are through some of the practices of yoga.
How long have you been a yoga therapist?
I've been a yoga therapist for getting on for 20 years now.
20 years now. And how, it's nice to measure things, as human beings we like to measure things, but how is the Alistair Livingstone now, as a consequence of that 20 years, different to the Alistair Livingstone that existed back 20 years ago?
Well, you recall, you know, when I was once on the program earlier, I was talking about a major car accident for me, which was a huge trauma.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was in a rehabilitation centre for quite a long time in Clacton, in Passmore Edwards. And what I saw there was an enormous number of people who were recovering from trauma of different dimensions. And some of them were able to cope really well with huge trauma, I mean immense trauma, you know, total paralysis down one side, whereas there were other people who really had, you know, and I'm making a value judgment of course, who ostensibly had really rather insignificant trauma by comparison.
Yes, yes.
But they didn't cope well with it. And one of the keynote speakers at the conference,
in Cork,
kept saying that, you know, that we all deal with these states of being in different ways, and so we have to start looking to see how we address them. This lady's name is Irene van der Giesen, and she is a recovering schizophrenic. She was diagnosed at a very early age with what's popularly known as schizophrenia.
Interesting that it's a recovering schizophrenic, not a recovered schizophrenic.
Well, she is a recovered.
She is recovered.
Well, if
it's possible.
if madness is part of our lives,
Yeah, it stays.
we're all mad,
And we deal with
so
it.
we deal with it.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
how do we find the harmony within all of this, Rowan? Yeah.
So this lady, what was the lesson that she was bringing to the conference from her own experience?
Well, let me just step back a little bit. One of the themes that began to emerge, there are a number of themes that I began to perceive. Now, you have to understand, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, but I do have some experience in these fields. And what I saw was that there is inevitably a trauma that is, if you like, the inciting incident for much of these conditions.
The Big Bang, the
There is
human
something.
big, whatever
There
it
is
is.
something.
Something occurs.
And the trauma can be as insignificant. Well, it can be as significant as the loss of somebody very close. But a lot of the trauma, and both Irene was talking about it because this is her journey, and also Professor John Reid from Liverpool University, who is a professor of psychology there, both talked about trauma being, you know, an underlying theme in all of this.
Trauma. And that trauma
So-
can be any number of things.
It can be any number of things.
Physical, emotional,
Yeah.
whatever.
With Irene, it was very serious physical and sexual abuse when she was a young child. And of course, this is something that is very important in our society.
Wow, goodness God, I've been hearing today of the story from the web stuff coming from the Far East,
Yes.
where people have been arrested in England and they're sex abuse of children on the web, for God's sake. So yes,
yes,
of course.
mean, so you know, there's the whole thing of grooming, but there's also the, I mean, with Irene, it was within the family, and what this did for her was to fragment her personality, and there is always, it seems to me, some kind of fragmentation of personality within this context.
And thus the schizophrenia.
Yeah, John Reid, Professor Reid, who I suppose within the psychiatric profession would be considered something of a maverick, was very clear that there is no genetic predisposition to schizophrenia, there is no brain disease, and these are verifiable. He's published a lot of work. He talks internationally at conferences. He's a psychologist, of course. He's a clinical psychologist, and you know, his work is immensely important in this field.
So really, what we're saying is that the business of mental imbalance, let's call it that, that it's not an illness that we're predisposed to through our DNA. That it is a consequence always of an incident that occurs in life that disrupts the perfection of the brain.
I think one has
Is that
to be
too
very
strong?
I think one has to be very careful about saying always. But it seemed to me that you know, that's a given. It's a given factor. And then, and really rather important, it's supported by the stigmatism within our society towards these conditions. And that is underlined and fully supported and encouraged by the drug companies, who of course have a
They're
huge
making the money, keep
investment
taking the
in
tablets.
That's
Yeah,
right.
for goodness sake.
And that is,
And well dare you as a patient get off the medication.
well,
Because you're, wow, God knows what'll happen to you. You'll grow two heads.
Irene was 20 years on medication. But eventually, she came off it and she went cold turkey. But it was through a whole process, and she was extremely fortunate. She was fostered at one stage in her treatment. And she had voices, of course, yes? but she came to recognize that these voices were only there because she allowed them to be there.
Which also takes us to the moment in individual lives where if we accept what was coming through to you at the conference, that an incident starts the imbalance, that whatever malady we endure as individuals in life in relation to our cognitive function, that we have the power to start investigating, regressing if you like, to try and establish, first of all, exactly what the incident was.
That's right.
And if you find the incident, then you can actually start to do something about it.
Yes, and there is an enormous amount of work in this field. Irene again, I mean, Irene was not only inspiring, but emotionally wrenching for the 500 delegates that listened to her.
Would be, I can imagine.
Yes, I mean, there were 500 delegates at the end of her half-hour dissertation who stood up and clapped with tears pouring down their faces, myself included. I mean, you know, just thinking about it and
you
her
imagine
journey.
the pain of her journey.
Yes.
My God.
And actually, the interesting thing was that after she went cold turkey, and after 20 years of abuse within her family and by the medical profession, because that's really what you have to label it as, she was diagnosed with an immune deficiency disorder.
Would that have been the incident?
No.
No.
The incident.
It was the abuse.
I mean, there were multiple incidents. There was physical abuse. There was sexual abuse by her father. I mean, it's you know, it's a multiplicity of factors. And of course, John Reed says that usually it is a multiplicity of factors. It's not just one. You know, because we have the mechanisms to cope with one, but if they're multiplied,
Seems to me you're taking yoga beyond yoga. Maybe it's not beyond yoga. Maybe that's the epicenter of yoga.
Yoga is about integration. The word yoga itself, as you know, Rowan, is to yoke, to bring together.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
So we're bringing together the mind, body, and spirit. Now, the spirit is very, very important in part of this, in the recovery process from this. There seems to be always fragmentation of the personality. And many years ago in Australia, I did a lot of work which was based on the work of Roberto Assaioli, which is called psychosynthesis, in which we investigate subpersonalities. Well, we all have subpersonalities.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But these subpersonalities need to be given voices, or they need to be given reverence in order to cope. But they don't.
Did you say reference or reverence?
Reverence.
Yes, I can understand that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I discovered in myself that I have a number of subpersonalities. One was the little boy. Yes.
What does that mean?
Well, I had to draw him at one time, and he was wearing a pair of shorts and T-shirt, you know, and he looked very lost. And the other of my personalities was that I remember was Mr. Big, who was kind of like like a 50s personality with pinstripe suit, who was the business bloke.
And were you doing that under some kind of hypnotic regression?
I trained.
You trained to do this?
I was training to do that.
To do that.
So one of the things that Irene said when she started her recovery process, she was extremely fortunate. She was fostered to a foster father, and the father he gave her the space for her to start talking about this, and he actually encouraged her to talk about it and to start to explore these voices. So he had what she called a voice dialogue, the inner voice dialogue between herself, her voices, and this man.
But it's not enough coming together. A woman who has been abused by her father is suddenly interfaced with a man as her foster father.
Well, that was very interesting, I think, because that, you know, I kind of saw that as rather difficult to begin with, but she just said that he was so supportive and so helpful, and he would the antithesis of everything that her father had been, of course, because nobody listened to her in her family. Now, we've talked about all of this fragmentation, and I talked also about Declan Hammond, who's homeopath and shaman, and also a tantric yoga practitioner, with whom I've become. He's become quite a good colleague and something of a friend. And his piece was on soul loss and recovery.
Now, what does that mean?
Well, what it means is that with all of this fragmentation, and it was very clear that, there were, as I said, there were 500 delegates at this conference from all over the world.
Yes.
And many, many keynote speakers. And what kept getting echoed was that within the fragmentation, something goes off to protect itself. Now, you can call it the soul, you could call it the higher self, you could call it the divine part of ourselves. So within the fragmentation, the way that Declan expresses it, and he was talking not just about traditional shamanic models, in which madness is revered, of course, but that in modern ways of looking at it, we see that part of ourselves goes away to protect itself.
So the soul deserts you.
A part of it.
And
If all the soul disappeared, we wouldn't be here.
yeah, so part of the soul disappears as a defense mechanism.
As a defense mechanism.
But it's there on standby waiting for you to press the button again,
Well,
so to speak.
I think what has to happen, and many of the speakers indicated this, you have to create a space in which that part of ourselves feels safe to come back.
And that's a physical space and it's a mental space.
Yes, I would call it, we have to create a sacred space, because the soul's sacred.
Yeah, could that be walking on a mountain? Could it be at the seashore?
Yes, but I think...
Is there that sort of physicality to it?
I think it's more to do with, coming into a yoga studio, if you like, or going into Declan's consulting rooms in Dublin, or working with a psychotherapist or a Reiki practitioner. There were people from many disciplines at this conference, all doing immensely valuable work.
You see, what's interesting me now, I'm sorry for cutting across you because we have about 5 minutes left, but this is very focused for me. I would not have automatically gone to yoga in the past because I've always been aware of the areas of sensitivity that we're talking about in oneself, and I was always close in there and well tuned there. And don't go to yoga because my bones are sore, my joints are bad, I'm growing old and all the rest of it. Not for me. But suddenly here we're finding a more the true heart of yoga, perhaps, the more holistic yoga that's taking the physicality, the spirituality, and the emotionality that's all in there together.
Yes.
And that's the sort of thing that can happen at the studio.
Well, this is the sort of thing that interests me particularly. I wouldn't say that, I think that there are, I'm going to be very rude, I think that there are a whole number of so-called yoga teachers in the world who are actually only interested in the physical, and they shouldn't really be calling it yoga at all.
Because there's no joined up stuff.
If you take away the underlying philosophy, which is exactly as you've expressed, an integration of the being. If you take that out of it, and it's only about moving your body into then it becomes posturing.
Yeah, posturing and meaningless as far as I would be concerned.
And for me too.
Yeah. So when are you going to roll this out? When is this going to be rolled out?
Well,
in Newry?
I think that this is something this is an ongoing thing. I told you when you invited me onto the program before Christmas that I didn't want to speak about it because I still had some thinking and some personal integration of this.
Yes, of course.
And I feel as if I've only just begun to kind of dip into this.
Something growing.
But there is something, I spoke to Declan the other day on the phone, and he said, oh, well, I think you're being called to do this kind of work, aren't you? So
and you would know that.
And I feel that, yeah. So, I think there's something hugely important here. Just to kind of finalise this, I went to Cork on the bus and the train because I'd actually had a trauma. I fractured my elbow before Christmas, so I didn't drive. I couldn't drive, you know, I've lived in Newry for 15 years now. I've never ever heard anybody talking about anybody that they knew with psychosis or schizophrenia. Yes, I've just not heard it. I got off the bus and I went into a coffee bar to have a coffee because somebody was picking me up to take me home.
Yes.
And I started talking about this because I was full of it, you know. And, you know,
Well, please.
and within 2 minutes, there were 2 people that said, "Oh, you know, I know so and so, and I know so and so."
Yeah.
And what's really clear, of course, is that the stigma attached to it means that it's very difficult for people to actually talk about it. So that has to come into the open. We have to find a way of bringing that out into the open. And just finally, of course, and we come back to John Reed, and it is, and if I will quote him if I may, because I want to be absolutely clear that I'm saying it. So he says that the notion of schizophrenia as a brain disease is that there is, or that there's a genetic predisposition is nonsense, unscientific and stigmatizing. Everyone who gets these diagnoses needing to be on medication is patently incorrect.
What I'm seeing and getting from you is that indeed you are being called to this, because you are opening another page for me in the book of yoga, and you're offering a complete image of yoga as it should be. That's what I'm seeing, because it's I have questions in my mind. You have, Andrew has, everybody has. So it's a question of walking that path and accommodating the various tensions and pressures and balancing out and all of that. I look forward to the year ahead because I think we're going to hear more about this from you.
Well, I think you will. Whether it's here or somewhere else, I'm not sure. One thing that I would just say, if there is anybody listening to the program and watching the program, Rowan, and you bring a valuable service yourself, I mean, you are in a way a yogi.
Well, I must say, I hope so.
In your own way.
In my own way.
You're very yogic, actually. And you do an invaluable service to this community, so thank you for that.
Bless you.
But what I would also say is that I've left here the website for Clinical Voices Network. And also the website for Irene van der Geysen, who now runs her own practice. And and it's criticalvoicesnetwork.com. That's what you have there. Yes.
Criticalvoicesnetwork.com, and I'll not even attempt the other one. But your local base is the Yoga Studio up in Abbey Yard in Newry. Thank you very much indeed. Wish you well. Andrew, music, please.